My name is Lauren, and it's Lauren. My maiden name is Brethauer, and that's Brethauer. My married name is Brantner, Brantner. It's tied to my heritage through the German churches that are there in the community or were, that were founded there. I've got family records in both those churches. My family went to those churches, and after my grandparents retired from farming, they lived in the East Side area for quite a number of years until my grandfather passed away, and then they took my grandmother, and that's the last time I had any direct connection other than church records to the community. But I grew up visiting and playing in the yard at my grandparents' house there. It was close to the sugar factory. We're tied to, we were stoop laborers when we first came here, and we're tied to the sugar factory because we're tied to that industry. We were brought in by the train loads from other places like Nebraska, and there was one train load from Kansas. And there are all these churches in the northeastern Colorado that were started by Germans from Russia. Our history sort of lends us to being involved in a church because in Russia we went from Germany to Russia into church colonies. So we were left independent of the Russian government except for taxes and a few things like that. But we were self-governing for a long time. And German was the language spoken. There was no Russian spoken until like 1875. They required that language. People went in the 1760s out of Germany into Russia. They were farmers for the most part, and they lived in colonies, and then their farm ground was outside the colony. So when things got rough as the Bolshevik Revolution approached and we were required to do military service, our men were, people got dissatisfied, and in about 1875 when they ordered all that, the Germans from Russia that were pacifists, like the Mennonites, they left, most of them. And some of the Catholics took trips into Kansas and into South America to scout out where to go. And some came that same period to part of Kansas that were Lutherans. And so people started looking seriously. And then as people trickled over, it was kind of like a monkey branch. Somebody got here and earned a little money and said, I've saved up enough for your trip. And they sent money back to family members. So my grandfather and grandmother came out of Russia by train until they got to Germany, and they got on a boat and crossed the Atlantic. And when they got to Baltimore, they got on a train and they knew where they were going, and they came directly to the depot here in Greeley, and they had relatives that were already here in the Bracewell area, and they went to work right away. They got here in time to be in the cycle for sugar beets. So there's a thinning and a hoeing cycle, and then later in the fall is the harvest cycle, but it runs from like April to November when you grow sugar beets, and almost all the labor was hand labor then, so that's what brought us here. We were recruited by railroads for workers, also by sugar factories, but most of it was word of mouth with relatives. And whole families got into that field. In fact, we came to the attention of the child labor movement, and we actually had a photographer come out to take pictures of us. So our earliest good photographs come about around this area from about 1913, and we were used pictures of children working in the fields. There's one in the basement here of a little girl with the sugar beet. Those pictures were done by Lewis Hine, and they're in the Library of Congress, and they're the first really formal posed pictures I think that most of us have about the work we did in the sugar beet industry. There was a pietist movement that went from Europe into Russia called the Brotherhood, and some of the churches had activities with that. It was a set apart from the either the Lutheran or the Congregational churches. It was not part of the regular church thing, but it was an extra pietist movement. And if you want to see a chapel, there's one in Windsor where they met to worship. But they were pietists, and they did not believe in a lot of the things that are traditional in Volga German families. Our weddings are celebrated with a big dance, a wedding dance, a Dutch hop, and food. And some of that happened. In fact, that happened in the neighborhood, and the families marched in. Musicians blew the band in. They had horns, and they blew the bride and the groom and the wedding party into either St. John's or St. Paul's. And then they had the wedding, and then afterwards they went somewhere. If they had a Dutch hop wedding, they went somewhere where people could dance. It started in houses, and you had to take turns dancing because people didn't have very big houses, but later it moved to public halls. So my brother had a Dutch hop wedding in 1964 here in Greeley, and his wedding was in a church, but his wedding dance was in the Moose Lodge. So that's how it worked. It was interesting, I think, in the 50s because it was post-World War II, and A.B. Gold had a junkyard on the east side, and my brothers were fascinated because there were all these old planes and, military excess equipment that they could sneak into A.B. Gold's junkyard and pretend they were flying a plane or whatever. We used to play on the bandstand. There was a bandstand, and when they put the swim pool in, that went away. But they used to have little band concerts and stuff there. And from some of our other members that actually lived there and grew up there, they had maypole dances in the park from out of the East Ward School. That's our school. We didn't originate the school, but that's where people went who lived in the neighborhood. That was the East Ward School. And they would come up and do things in the park because it was open space and it was public space. But they'd have little band concerts on that bandstand occasionally, and you could sit on the Grandma and Grandpa's front porch and listen to music. But my fascination was going to the Bright's Fish Market. I never understood until I got interested in researching later years and talked to people. There were Japanese people in there in the neighborhood, not directly around the park, but in the perimeters. There were Japanese people living there, and I could not figure out why there was a Japanese fish market across the street from my grandparents' house, and everybody else in there was German Russian. But we would go over, and that was my first view of an octopus, was looking at his fish tables where he had everything laid out to sell. That's the first time I saw an octopus. The other place we would go to get penny candy was the East Side Market, and they made homemade German sausage, and that was a fixture in that neighborhood for years. There was also other grocery stores. When I did Historic Colorado newspaper research, I found there were other ones, but they didn't last as long as that particular one. It was ideal for my grandparents. They couldn't drive anymore. Grandma could walk to church and do all the church activities. She went to St. Paul's. She could walk half a block to the grocery store. All these people lived around. Volga Germans visit a lot. So we got dragged around to visit people with our grandparents when we stayed there. And that was a tradition from Russia. So they'd find a park bench, or they'd go to visit in other people's houses, and they'd sit and talk in German for hours. We had to sit real still, because if we started wiggling, Grandpa would give us a look. But that's the things that I saw. I also, I met other children that lived there or were visiting their grandparents. So, and they lived right catty corner on their alley to the, what is his last name? Borgens. His daughter's still active in the neighborhood, and she lives in that house, his granddaughter, I guess. And I used to watch him. He called birds in. He would do these whistles, and he fed birds. And they'd come and land on his arms, and he would feed them with his hands. And we were fascinated by him, and we played with his grandchildren sometimes in the backyard. Okay. Well, because we were so young, we weren't allowed to walk off and wander around. My brothers, I'm sure, are 5 and 7 years older than I was, and I'm sure they ranged all over the place. But I know from St. John's history, sometimes they walked to the Poudre River from that church and had some kind of services there for the brotherhood. But it was an interesting neighborhood when I discovered how large it actually was. To me, to my world as a child, it was that little square around the church and the park. That was kind of my neighborhood, because I didn't know what was out there in the bigger world.
Right. So, since you've spent so much time there as a younger girl, what can you say about how the neighborhood has changed since then?
It's got more people from other ethnic backgrounds or other nationalities, however you want to phrase that, and that's not a bad thing. I grew up about 7 miles from Deerfield, which was a black colony along Highway 34, and I was fascinated with the buildings there when I was a kid growing up. Every time we went to Greeley, we passed those buildings, and I was very surprised to find that some of the people that left that colony when they didn't get enough water moved into the East Side neighborhood. So we had some black people that lived in that colony. And in fact, I knew one of them. He was kind of a junk man. He had a little truck, and he cleaned up stuff for people, and his name was Osborne, his last name, and he was from out of that colony, and that really surprised me when I learned about that later, that I knew somebody that came from there that lived in the East Side neighborhood. The churches look the same. They have different people in them. The house where my grandparents lived was I think it had been a single-family dwelling, and it was kind of split down the middle, and it had a back door, and there was one unit back there, and there was a little old lady called Mrs. Kabobel who lived there, and we talked to her once in a while when we were playing in the backyard. But there was a bedroom, a front room, and a big kitchen, and a bathroom, and it wasn't a very big unit, so I'm thinking it must have been. So it was a front-to-back duplex, not the way we do it now, side to side. It was front to back. And that building's still there, and there are people still living in it. I think they built in a front porch on it, and it looks a little different. But I think the Borgen's house looks the same. And my oldest cousin, who's kind of the matriarch of our family, both her grandparents, her mother's parents and her dad's parents, lived in that square around the church and the park. So as we took the tour for our convention in 2023, we had people on board that we asked to come who had relatives or who grew up there. And they would tell us where they lived or where their grandparents lived, and they said the houses looked pretty much the same in the few that we looked at. And Betsy Kellums told us all the different styles of architecture there was in that location, and pointed out the perimeters, and I was kind of shocked how big the area was, because that little neighborhood was what I thought was the East Side. And I actually did a program at Chautauqua last year, or in 2023, and one of the people that was escorting people in and out of the programs, she asked me who I was and what I was doing. I said I was doing a slide program on Germans from Russia. And I said, you had a big neighborhood here on the East Side. And she says, yeah, She said, I'm Hispanic, and I grew up in that neighborhood, and there were all these old people speaking some other language, and I didn't know what it was. Those were Germans? I said, yes. We also had one member who just passed away, who grew up on the other side of Highway 34, close to the sugar factory. But that was part of the east side then, too. It crossed the highway. I can tell you what the neighborhood was like when my father, who was born in 1912, he was confirmed in St. Paul's Church. My family was farming at Kersey at that point in time, so Grandpa would bring them in and to the edge of town and by the sugar factory, and they had to walk into the church. And my dad said he was really glad that his brother Fred, who was older, waited to be confirmed with him, because those neighborhood kids didn't want people from the outside coming in, and they had to fight their way into confirmation and fight their way out, because those kids wanted to fight. So, and that's kind of behavior that I've seen people mention that happened in Russia, that they got really clannish and closed off sometimes and didn't want anybody from the outside coming in. So that was what it was like when my dad was growing up. But when we were kids, there was none of that behavior. In fact, most of the kids we saw were busy running around on their bicycles, and they weren't in groups, big groups like that.
Yeah. It's pretty open and welcoming when you were growing up?
Yeah.
Okay. Well,
And my grandparents would say, oh, the Walters have their granddaughters here. Do you want to meet them? And we'd go visit with somebody who spoke English. I don't think there's a cohesive identity that existed during the times that I was growing up. And when my grandparents lived there, there was a real kind of a neighborhood identity, and people knew each other and visited. But, you know, television took care of that. People don't visit and don't play cards and do any of those things, so I can't blame that on, you know, there were external forces that created all of that. But I don't know, someone who's lived there continuously, Sandy probably could tell. Okay. She lives in the Borgen's house. She could probably give you a really long view of what's changed. My husband worked with her brother, Buzz, at Home Light and Power. And she stayed in the neighborhood, but I don't think Buzz did. But, you know, as those people died off and families moved and people moved their residences west as the city grew and the churches eventually moved, that changed all the dynamics too. You know, nothing's forever and everything changes, and those churches have lost their identity as solely Volga German churches too, because they're not. One of the things that we got when we went to Grandma and Grandpa's, they drank coffee. And they had this, I guess it came from Russia. They poured their coffee from the cup into saucers and drank it. But they put a sugar cube in their mouth, and they drank that coffee through the sugar cube from those saucers, and we were just flabbergasted when we would see them do that. But she would let us have coffee, but it was half cream, and we thought we were really grown up. The other things that she did that was a special treat, my grandmother knew when we were coming, and she always made grevel, which is a sour cream based pastry that's rolled in sugar and it's twisted and fried and rolled in sugar. And she made blini, which is part of the food tradition from Russia. They're very thin pancakes, and they're like crepe, only they're big. They usually made them on a big skillet. She would save those for us. She would make those and roll sugar and cinnamon in them, and that was a treat. And she always made it special that we were there. She was very, very sweet, and all her daughters-in-law talked about what a wonderful mother-in-law she was. She was really loving and kind. And she always had her quilt rack up. She made hundreds of quilts in her lifetime after she got here. And she used to be sucking on a mint and trying to figure out how her patches laid out. And she had I have her sewing machine. It's a 1912 Singer Treadle. I could still sew with it because there's no electrical.
Right.
But she would work that treadle with her foot and do the patchwork, and it was fascinating to watch her do that. So that was one of my favorite things. And then she had a huge quilting rack after she got it, the top layer done. Then she took a filling layer and then like a muslin or some plain fabric on the bottom, and they stretched that tight, and then they started working on it. And I'm sure she probably had friends that came over. They visited while they quilted. But just seeing them, and I remember my grandpa was so bored. He was a farmer all of his life, and he would water the whole lawn with a hose because he was bored. He watered by hand with the whole yard with the hose just to get out of the house and pretend he was farming again, I think. But my grandmother had, she had a Maytag washing machine, a Ringer, in her. It was in the. They had a fairly big bathroom, and that was the laundry room too. And I can remember we had one of those too growing up, so I knew how all of that worked. But just having meals with them and spending time one-on-one, because when family got together, there were 7 kids with families, and so, we played with our cousins growing up. We did everything with our cousins when they came to visit. But it was like a madhouse when we all descended on Grandma and Grandpa's for Christmas or holidays or whatever, and they'd shoo us outside because they wanted to visit. So those memories are good too of when the whole family came, but there weren't a lot of them.
Yeah.
The house was too small.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. So then we talked about your grandparents' house. Did you have an address for that one, or?
No, I haven't been able to figure out what it was because the number's not on the house anymore. So I don't know. I'll ask Betsy. Maybe there's some way I can figure out what it was in here. Maybe in one of the old directories or something.
Okay. Yeah.
But it's 4th Avenue, and it's a block down from the school. And it's in the same block as St. Paul's, and was across the street from the fish market and a couple doors down from East Side Market, so they were right in the thick of it. I don't know if it's still active or not, but there was a bean plant there where they brought in pinto beans from the farmers, and they hired a lot of the Volga German women to come in and sort those. So that was in the neighborhood. And one of my aunts worked at the bean plant to earn extra money. And there was a big ice house where people got block ice, but I'm trying to think. There were a few things closer to Highway 34, but I think there was an old grocery store there, and there was another grocery store that was closer to the north end of the neighborhood. And there was a lot of people that went at noon there to eat lunch, and they sold kraut burgers and did that sort of stuff. And there were 2 Volga German women that I knew them, and they made the kraut burgers and ran that grocery store still in the greater neighborhood in the past 2000 probably. There were a lot of seed storage places along there because it was on the rail line. That rail line dictated some of the structure of the neighborhood. I wasn't familiar with people that did that. I know some of them did because not everybody farmed. Most of them did, but not everybody. And gradually over time, people started doing other things. So it's kind of interesting. We have in the area probably 3 100-year farms, and 2 of them are Volga German, and 1 is Black Sea German. And 2 in LaSalle and 1 west of Greeley, the Firestein farm. And it's a 100-year farm, and it's a destination place now. And Those people are part of our chapter, our American Historical Society of Germans from Russia chapter, and we have events there occasionally. But I'm sure there were people that worked in those places that are younger sons of families who did something else for a living, because not everybody in that neighborhood, in fact, probably most of them weren't farmers, unless they were retired farmers, because they would have had to drive back and forth. So I'm not sure there was a lot of industry there, but there were small things besides the farm, the agricultural related stuff along the railroad tracks. I'm not aware. Later there was a lot of farm machinery stuff along Highway 34, but I didn't consider them part of the neighborhood. There were a lot of places in the history of Dutch hop dancing. That started out to be just a wedding thing, but then it spread out to other people. When people got here, they didn't have to just have a wedding to have a dance. And so there was a place called the Redbird that was across Highway 34 from that neighborhood, and there was, it was not heated. That's how far back it goes. And they danced there. They did Dutch hop dances there, and that's gone. And there was a pavilion on Seeley's Lake, that's west and north of Greeley. There was a pavilion there, and my parents' Dutch hop wedding dance in 1938 was at that pavilion, and it's gone, burned down.
Yeah.
But, and the East Side School, East Ward is still there, but I don't think it's a school anymore. But I think there were probably a lot of activities tied to that school, that people did things at the school. But I don't know of any place within the neighborhood where people gathered to dance or things happened. Our chapter is the largest in the international organization. Our international headquarters are in Lincoln, Nebraska. But there were Germans from Russia that migrated to Canada and to South America. So sometimes at our conventions, we have Spanish-speaking people, and we have Canadians with accents. And so it's kind of interesting. One memorable moment stood out for me, and it was in Casper, Wyoming. And we had a person that was a mainstay of our organization. His name was Art Flegler. And we had kind of a lull in the convention, and people were just in a hall visiting, and we had this contingent of church ladies from Entre Rios in South America visiting the convention. And they had a translator with them to speak out of Spanish, because but they still knew how to sing in German. And Art was a wonderful singer, so Art started singing in a group. They love to sing too. They sang all the time in Russia. So he started a singing group, and they were sitting there doing hymns. And those ladies looked at him, and they asked through the interpreter, "Can we join?" And they said yes, and they could sing in German yet, but they spoke Spanish. So we have interesting juxtapositions. And we still have some of those people who managed to get out of Russia during Stalin's terror regime. And when Hitler invaded Russia in 1941, all the German-speaking people in Russia were loaded on cattle cars and shipped to Kazakhstan and Siberia into Trude Army camps. And it wasn't till Glasnost, which is about 1986, I think, that they were allowed to come out of those camps and go to Germany. And so we had people trying to connect with us from Germany whose families were totally torn apart during the period in the Trude Army camps. And a lot of them were worked to death. So we have people people in Germany that that didn't know we were here. We're trying to help those people by studying their dialects. And my family is from Sturb. My grandfather's family was from Sturb, Fritz, Hesse. So they were Hessians, and they have a special dialect. So I made contact with the city of Sturb, Fritz, and I found out they were trying to help German immigrants by trying to help them identify if they had a Hessian dialect. In Sturb, Fritz, they recognize a German-Russian Hessian dialect. So, you know, language is like food. It picks up wherever you are, things from that culture. So they still recognized it, but there's some families used to argue about whether some of the words we called things were Russian or Germans, you know. So that's been an interesting thing to watch, to see. And we've actually brought people to our conventions that came out of those Truth Army work camps. And one of our international board members, Michael Brown, is visiting. He's a retired professor from the University of Wyoming. He's been visiting Kazakhstan, and he had family who actually emigrated there before all the trial and tribulation began. But he does programs about. He does a program about the German artists during how they survived in those Truth Army work camps, and he shows pictures of what they produced. They didn't have any paints and what they made to make their brushes, but the art continued even in those horrible circumstances. And so there's a lot of sorrow among our people. My family stopped hearing anything in the 1920s. And when the Bolsheviks came into the colonies, some of them fought back and they were loyal to the Tsar. So there were people that were, there was one whole village that was gone because they fought back, and there were other people that were killed for fighting back. They lost their farms when the socialization project began. They got worked, if they had some sort of a skill set, they got put in communes to farm. They got put in communes to make equipment. They lost everything, and they lived through starvation periods. And when World War I started, that stopped the people immigrating, and then the communists took over and just put an iron fist around everything, so they couldn't get out very well. Not very many. I find people occasionally that got out in the 1920s, but I have a lot of personal feeling of sorrow about all those lost people, and we don't know what happened to them. One of my grandfather's nephews was captured during World War I, and he was in a prison camp in Frankfurt, Germany for a while, and he got out. I've been trying to figure out, he came back just in time for the revolution. And so I've tried to figure out what happened to him. I've tried to trace his military service. I have a picture of him, but I don't know what happened to him. I may never know. All the records that we get out of Germany were captured from our churches, and Russia, we have to pay a Russian researcher to look at our own church records, and then they can sell information out of there. But that's gotten to the point where the climate in Russia is so bad. We used to lead tours there. We haven't done a tour there for about 4 or 5 years. The political climate is bad, and it's hard to get any research out. They still managed to get some, but it got really touchy for a while. So we have people that still go there, and we have people that were Russian academics with German from Russia roots. And so some of them have been interesting to work with. And they know their history. They know which colony. If you're German from Russia in the Volga area, you know whether you are on the Bergeseite or the Wiesenseite. The Bergeseite is the side of the Volga River that's hilly, and the Wiesenseite is the plain. So they say, I'm from Walter on the Wiesenseite. Or I'm Trupp from the Bergeside. That's how they identify themselves geographically from those places. But I've seen so many trip slides and programs about people who did go there. I have never wanted to be there. It feels creepy to me. There's nothing left to my village except the church, the Lutheran church that was built there in 1902. The roof is gone. It was a new building, when my grandparents got married in it. And it's a beautiful red brick building. And people that take pictures of the interior, you can still see some of the decorative touches on the walls and stuff. But the period after the revolution, they tore down the church towers and starved out the churches and persecuted people that went to church. They couldn't have religion anymore. So there's a lot of sorrow about all that and about the starvation and the not being able to find the lost people.
Do you mind me asking how you got involved in the organization that you're part of?
My parents belonged to a Sterling chapter, and I thought about joining the one here for quite a while, but I was busy raising kids and working, and so I thought, But when my kids were in high school, a friend of mine he was a local businessman named Larry Bolander, they recruited him to be the chapter president, and he grabbed me to be an officer, and we worked together for years. He's Black Sea German, and his wife's Volga German, and he passed away in 2022. But we worked together for years on projects. We did a huge project to do all the obituaries on all the areas. I used to call it harvesting. I harvested obituaries all weekend when I was working. I knew where the people were and where the newspapers were or the funeral homes where I could, and we tried to keep track of people that way. We have a treasure trove of obituaries that are, the earliest ones are in German, from the churches and from all over in Canada and the US. But we worked on that together for about 10, 12 years, trying to save those records. So I've been trying to save the culture and the records for as long as I've been in, and they pulled me in as an officer, and I've never not been an officer in the almost 35 years I've been in the organization, and I served about 7 or 8 years on the international board. So I drove to Lincoln about 4 times a year and gathered with Germans from Russia from all over.
Mm-hmm. And you said your parents were a part of it? Were they?
Yeah, they belonged to the chapter in Sterling, Colorado, because they moved from Wiggins, where I grew up, out to Yuma, and there were quite a few farmers, Volga German farmers out there, so they went to a little church in Otis, Colorado, that was a Volga German Lutheran church, and they went to the Sterling chapter for AHSGR till it finally disbanded. There was a chapter in Fort Morgan, it's gone. There's 2 chapters left in the whole state of Colorado, and that's Denver Metro and us, and we've done, 3 or 4 conventions, international conventions together. The 2 chapters did. And this time when we did it, they were not operational. And so our chapter had to do all of the work for the 2023 convention. And they pressured us to take it kind of not, we didn't have a year's preparation, so it was a madhouse. Getting ready and finding speakers, and you have all these committees working within the host committee, and then you had all these there's a board convention committee, and we had to coordinate with them, and we had to coordinate with staff, so it's kind of a crazy time.
Yeah.
But it's so valuable to have that time to share information. We have a research room. We also have, for people that want to do genealogy about this area, we have a genealogy chairperson, and right now I'm doing that as well as being president of our chapter because our person passed away last year. But we have a genealogy kit with all these things in it that you need that you might not find in your library, probably won't. And it's like 5 big plastic tubs full of stuff, and if they need to ask for help here for looking up records and stuff, that I'm the person they contact right now. And the other thing I'd like to say about us is that we have over time learned that we can't do everything ourselves. So we learned to work with the Poudre River Heritage people. We learned to work with CSU. We have our chapter archives in the Sidney Heitman Germans from Russia collection there. We learned to work with other organizations that are doing historical stuff like the Windsor Severance Historical Association. We learned to work with libraries within the district, and we tried to make contacts with museums. I did a program with Mary Lauk, who is our last long-term president, at the Kersey Museum, and we're working with them to help them set up stuff for their Heritage Center. And we've worked with Betsy on other projects, Betsy Callum's, and we've learned you can't do it all yourself, and you can share valuable information by working with other groups of people. So I applaud these museums that are starting to work into heritage, and they're working with all the people in their area who have heritage there. And they're not just, narrowing in on the most populous group in the neighborhood. They're picking up everybody's history and doing a heritage center that acknowledges all the people that settled in an area. And I think that's great. Even though we're narrowly focused, we need to interface with all the other people too and learn things from how they're working. I pulled Betsy into our international convention to talk about, we called this the East Side Project then, because we identify the area as East Side, and I know it's called Sunrise Project. But we pulled her in to talk to us about what was happening, and I was working with her about that project, and we had done some scouting and got people in the chapter to do stuff in the preparation for the application. So we had been working with her all along with that process. And I pulled her into the tours because she led the tours on the East Side during our convention. And then we had a session on East Side, and she popped up in the door, and I said, "Get in here. We need you in here." And she says, "Oh, I see, did somebody not show up?" And I said, "No, you have valuable information for us." So she talked about the historic preservation stuff, and it was so important to me that she came, because I realized there's a lot of people in other parts of the country that don't understand how important it is to have a historic preservation group to work with to save your neighborhood that you can't do by yourself. None of us. The Hispanics, the Japanese, the Germans from Russia, the English-speaking people who are other ethnic varieties in that neighborhood, we couldn't do that without the historic preservation people in the city. And I wanted them to see what was possible. There's historic neighborhoods from different groups all over the country. I know they've tried to save some of the stuff in the bottoms next to Lincoln, which was a historic area where they had churches and schools and where they settled. But I don't think they've done as much work as our preservation people here. And there's been some done in Fort Collins, and some of our chapter members have cooperated with that. But it hasn't always worked smoothly, and I don't see any glitches in this program here. So I'm really pleased that we have come to that conclusion. We belong to the Colorado Council of Genealogy Societies. We pay, dues to the Windsor Severance Group, and we try to interact and intermingle with other groups to learn from them, and from them to share what works with us, because we're all struggling to survive. Things have changed drastically. All the service organizations are dying away, and our membership is declining. Our average age is probably somewhere in the 70s. Our youngest members are in their 50s. My grandson is a member. He's 23, but he's not interested in doing these things now. He's a college student working on doing things. And so, you know, we tried and we never could figure out how to meet young people and get them into, because the cultural divide it's chasms apart, because we assimilated so well that younger people don't even, unless they're in a hardcore family like mine where they have to listen to me lecture all the time, they don't know what their history is. And they don't know. We used to do booths out in the community festivals and we handed out copies of our newsletters and of our board publications. We have a journal that's been in publication for a long time, and we picked up extra copies of that to get out to people so they knew who we were. Those all went away. They're now beer festivals. So it's just been, since I've been in the organization, there's a lot of change. And I just don't think we're going to be able to survive in the form we're in now. I don't know what will be. Larry Kimball, who's on our board, and he's also on the international board, he thinks it will be a research center eventually, but all the activities probably won't survive. And we have a foundation with millions of dollars in it. And I hope if we get to that point, that foundation will be used to keep that research center open, because hundreds of people worked really hard to save all those things. And it's the largest Volga German collection in the world. Our museum and library is. So I hope it survives.